So here we are on the very last session of Take Another Look. I can't believe that this is number 6. I'm sure you can't believe it either. I hope you've been blessed and encouraged and built up by this season. Any feedback that I've had has been really positive. In this last session that looks at the verses between Colossians 3:15 and 4:6, we're going to look at what might be entitled a new vision for growth, or a vision for growth. It's not so much that in these verses the Apostle Paul sets out steps towards growth, but the things that he talks about are things that help to produce a really healthy climate in a church, or even in a home, or in a workplace for that matter, because it's when we create a particular kind of environment that growth happens. We can talk all we want about growth, and we want to grow, and we want to do this and that and the other thing, but if the environment is unhealthy, we will not produce growth. It's a bit like, it's a bit like bringing up children. You don't say to your children, I want you to grow. How much have you grown this week? And what you do is you feed them, you clothe them, you make sure they have shelter. In other words, you make sure that they have a healthy environment in which they can flourish. And it's the same in church. It's as it is in family life, and as it is in a workplace. So let's just take a look for a few moments at what Paul talks about when it comes to producing a healthy environment, an environment in which we can grow. First of all, you might say in verses 3:15 and following that Paul sets out some of his priorities. Things like, he says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. If there's not peace, and not peace in our hearts, there's unlikely to be a climate in which we can grow. Paul says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. The Amplified version of the Bible expresses it like this: let the peace of Christ act as an umpire in your hearts. The role of an umpire in any sort of sport is to say what's right and what's not right. It's like a referee. So it's like the peace of Christ as a referee. If you're seeking God and seeking God's will and making some particular decision, it's a good practice to ask yourself the question, how am I really feeling about this? How is this affecting my peace? And if you don't have peace about something, well then that just might be the peace of Christ acting as a referee or an umpire in your heart and saying, I don't think you should do this. This isn't a very good move. And then Paul talks about, he says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. He talks about giving thanks, and he talks about praise, thankfulness and praise, speaking to one another, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, positive interaction with each other, teaching and admonishing each other. These are the sorts of things that are very important in any healthy environment. If we're going to have a healthy environment in Glasgow Elim Church, or if you're going to have a healthy environment in your group, it's so important that the peace of Christ rules. It's so important that there's positive interaction, that we teach and admonish each other. Admonish is an old word. It's not a word that we use often these days, but it's got the flavor of both teaching, but also a teaching that comes with a little bit of a challenge or an exhortation. So we're meant to sort of spur one another on, to coach each other, to encourage each other in that way. And then we're meant to be people of praise. Paul says that we're to do this as we sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. An atmosphere of praise is an atmosphere of growth. And then he talks about thankfulness. If we develop a thankful heart, a thankful life, it just changes the way that we see the world. It changes the way that we see each other. And sometimes I think we'd all do a lot better if we focused on the things that we can give thanks for, rather than the things that aren't working out for us. So Paul talks about these different facets that go towards making a climate of growth. These are some of his priorities. And a second thing that Paul talks about here is he talks about people. He talks about how we're to interact with each other. And he talks about families. He talks about what we might call the workplace. And of course, all of this has reference to the church as well. Because we must remember in all this that church is essentially the people. The health of the church is essentially dependent on its people and the connection between its people. So Paul talks about families, he talks about husbands, he talks about wives, he talks about children, he talks about masters, he talks about slaves. Paul goes through the whole range here. Now there's something that needs to be said right from the beginning in this particular part of the teaching, is that Paul isn't endorsing slavery. Okay, so he's not making a kind of a defense of slavery, nor is he setting out a vision for the family. Now, obviously, we all have a vision for family. We know what the Bible says about marriage and how marriage is the context in which we should have children, bring children into the world and bring them up in God's ways. But what Paul is doing here is he's not making a case for any particular thing or any particular practice. What he's doing is he's addressing the situation that was the situation of the day, the current situation in the Roman Empire. This was mainly the structure of society in the Roman Empire. In fact, the Roman Emperor Augustus was so convinced that marriage and family brought stability that he passed some laws that really backed up the family and reinforced marriage. So Paul is addressing something that was contemporary, something that was in the context of the day. Slavery is also an important one for us to think about here. You might say, well, why doesn't Paul just challenge something that we know is wrong and that he knew was wrong? I think there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, in the Roman world, sometimes a slave was actually better off than someone who was poor. Because at least if you were a slave and you had a good master, then you had shelter and you were looked after and you had a life. Whereas if you were a poor person who had none of that sort of social protection around them, your life could be very, very hard indeed. So to just abolish slavery at a stroke like that, or say it was wrong and say, just forget about it altogether, it wasn't necessarily in the interest of some of those people. But that's probably not the strongest point. That's just a kind of a by-the-way thing. A second thing about slavery was this, that Paul wasn't really in a position to challenge something that was as pervasive in society as slavery in his day. Because don't forget, the Roman Empire was not a democratic institution. It was very top-down. The Romans, they did rule with a kind of a rod of iron, and they knew what it was to have popular uprisings. Once there was a slave uprising. If you've ever seen the film Spartacus, that's what it's all about. So if Paul was seen to be challenging this in a very direct way, he could have been seen as some kind of terrorist who was trying to bring instability into the Roman Empire. And of course, that wasn't Paul's main objective. Paul's main objective, it wasn't his objective at all. Paul's main objective was to bring the gospel to the people throughout the empire. A third thing to bear in mind is that in other scriptures, I'm thinking of 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says that if you're a slave, you should try to gain your freedom, which was possible under the law. And I think Paul was anxious that whatever people should do, they should do it within the framework of the laws of the day. So Paul would encourage people, if they were slaves, to go through the legal process of gaining their freedom. And then we find in this passage that Paul says that masters should be, they should treat their slaves fairly. And some of the translations of Colossians actually suggest that Paul's saying to the masters, you should really pay your slaves. You should reward them for what they do. So I hope that helps to to clear up that one. Perhaps it's raised even more questions in your mind. But Paul wasn't endorsing anything. He was simply trying to address something and to give some direction for that particular time, at that particular moment in history. So what does he say, and how can this help us? Well, he talks about, wives submitting to their husbands, and husbands loving their wives, and children obeying their parents. And then he talks about slaves respecting their master, and working hard and working as for the Lord, and knowing that the Lord is the one that rewards you, and being honest in what you do. These are all facets of healthy interactions between people in different aspects of life. In fact, in this case, he was probably talking about households as such, because often households kept slaves. So, what can we learn from that? How does that work for us? Because obviously we're in a very, very different social context to the people at Colossae. It's a very, very different world that we live in. Thankfully, we live in a world in which slavery has been legally abolished. But nevertheless, some of these principles, or in fact all of the principles, can be applied in different ways to our lives today. I think first of all, when it comes to family relationships, we don't have to just restrict ourselves to what Paul says about husbands and wives and children. No, that is the very, very thrust of what he says, that there should be respect, there should be honor, there should be love in the family, there should be obedience on the part of children, and that fathers should treat their kids in a particular way that's godly and honoring to God. So all of that remains true. But I think we can even extend that even to a wider family circle, wider family network, that these principles of honor and respect are all good for us today, and they go towards making a healthy environment, a healthy climate. And I think too, some of the things that Paul says can be transferred to the workplace of today. Thankfully, you don't work as a slave, though sometimes you might feel as though that's the way that you're employed. But you can take those principles of being honest in your work and working hard and doing what you do as though you're working for the Lord, and knowing that it's not your particular boss that you're serving, it's the Lord that you're serving, it's Him that you're working for, and He will reward you. And if you find yourself in a place where you're the boss or you're the supervisor or whatever, well then treat people fairly. Treat them the way that you would want to be treated yourself. I think that's what comes out of what Paul says here, and something that we can apply to our lives today. A third thing that I think is helpful as we seek to develop a climate in which growth happens is, but Paul talks about prayer. He says that we're to be devoted to prayer, being watchful and thankful. And the longer I've been around, and the longer I've been around church, the more I'm convinced that developing prayer as a lifestyle is actually more effective than just doing sort of big prayer initiatives. Now, I'm not against big prayer initiatives. We've done some in Glasgow Elam. I love it at New Year when we do a week or 10 days or whatever, and we have times of focused prayer, times of seeking the face of God. But I think what you get from these verses, where Paul says that we're to be devoted to prayer, I think he's talking about something it's not just being in church praying all the time. It's about having prayer as a lifestyle. And he says that we should be watchful and thankful. In other words, we should be looking out. We should be looking for answers to our prayers. We should be looking for things to pray into and to pray for. And we should do that in a context of thankfulness to God for what He has done, and also thankfulness for what He's going to do. Do you remember Philippians 4 verse 6, where Paul says that we're to not worry or not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in everything through prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. So Paul says, be watchful and thankful. So if we want to see a climate in which growth can take place, develop, we're looking, as we saw first of all, at establishing some priorities, and then thinking about how we interact with one another, and thirdly, this whole idea of a lifestyle of prayer. I think it's just brilliant that our groups are getting together on a weekly basis, that we get together on a monthly basis, that we have the hardwired prayer, that we have the Wednesday prayer, the Monday night prayer, and as a church community we're developing a lifestyle of prayer. I think that's absolutely fantastic. And then finally, another thing that helps us as we seek to develop a climate in which growth happens is we want to adopt a particular posture towards the people of the world that we live in. Paul talks about our conversation and how our conversation, the way that we speak and the way, again, that we interact with other people should always be full of grace. It should be seasoned with salt, and so that we're able to give a reason, so that we're able to have a positive impact on people around us. Sometimes I think we just need to think of how others see us, how they see the way that we relate towards them or the way that we respond to them, not just in church, not even just in our families, but to the outside world as well. You know, we have an opportunity to change the environment by simply being positive in our speech, by saying things that we can give thanks for, by saying things in other people that we can praise and that we can encourage. I want to encourage you to do that, just to develop that posture of grace towards others, towards each other, and towards outsiders as well. So there we are. We've come to the end of Take Another Look. I hope that these short studies in Colossians have really built you up, and I pray that as you do this study, that you will just get a new vision for growth, and you'll get a new passion for building people up, a new passion to establish and reestablish perhaps, or even celebrate some of those priorities which are already established in your groups. I pray that you'll go for it in prayer, and I pray that you'll have a passion to have an impact, a positive impact on the people that you interact with on a daily basis.